Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckcom. Thank you to everybody for liking, sharing, rating, and interacting with the podcast. It's doing really, really well, and each episode seems to get more and more likes, listens, shares. So thank you very much for that. I time the next episode to release as close to the election as possible, and that's because my next guest is one of the clearest thinkers I have ever had the pleasure of reading or talking to. I'm talking about Ben Hunt of Epsilon Theory. Ben was born and raised in Alabama. He attended Vanderbilt University, where he earned degrees in government, political science, and computer science. He then went to Harvard, where he earned PhDs in philosophy and government. Ben spent a decade as a professor, first at New York University and then at Southern Methodist University. And he's also started 2 successful software companies and sold them. And he's now the creator of Epsilon Theory and the inspiration behind Second Foundation Partners. Over 100,000 professional investors across 180 countries read Ben's work. In the episode, Ben and I talk about the true underlying drivers of human behavior, including unstructured information, narratives, and stories. We talk about the real world versus the narrative world, the welding shut of the American mind, the importance of finding critical distance, BITFD, which is Ben's acronym for Burn It the Fuck Down. Ben thinks we need massive, massive change in our markets, in our capital economy, and in our government. And he talks a lot about that in the podcast. We talk about protest and rejecting violence. We talk about rethinking the way we express our identity, i.e. not expressing our identity through politics anymore, which has become basically an epidemic over the last 10 years. I know a lot of people, and I know you listening to this podcast, you know people that put their politics above their religion, quite literally. So Ben and I talk about all of this stuff. We talk about how to get back on track and how to think clearly and accurately about the current state of American affairs. This was a phenomenal episode. Ben is a really, really nice guy and a brilliant, brilliant person. I think you're really going to like this episode. It's perfect timing because we're releasing it shortly before the election. And so if you want to think clearly, listen to this episode. And now I give you Ben Hunt. Hey, everybody. Brian Beckcom here. And I have got Ben Hunt of Epsilon Theory. Ben, how the heck are you doing today, man?
I can't complain, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show. Really glad to be here.
Kind of difficult times as we're shooting this podcast. We've got, crazy politics. We've got the pandemic. We've got racial relation issues, things like that. Before we get into what I think is going to be a absolutely fascinating conversation about you and your work, how's your family doing through all this stuff?
Well, thanks for asking, Brian. The family's great. I've got 4 daughters ranging in age from 16 to 23.
Nice.
So, they're a couple of them are out of the house. A couple of them are still here in the house. It's always been a family filled with estrogen. Everyone's happy and safe. Brian, thanks for asking. And what about you?
I'm doing really good. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a pro basketball player yesterday, and he's got 2 sons. I've got 2 boys and a daughter, and he was making the comment that when he was 75, he was going straight to the nursing home. And I said, yeah, I got a daughter that's going to take care of me. So, that's great, Ben. So, you and I actually have a little bit something in common. I just released a podcast episode about an hour ago with Jackie Sherrill. Yeah, that's right.
I saw it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so super great episode. But Jackie went to Alabama, won 2 national championships as a football player under Bear Bryant.
Yeah.
And then he coached at A&M. And you're an Alabama football fan, and I'm a big Aggie.
Yeah, I saw the Jackie Sherrill podcast that you sent out, and so went straight to it. Yeah, so I am from Alabama originally. My grandfather played at Alabama football in the he was on the 1919 team, the 1920 team, and the 1921 team. So really back in the day. I grew up in the Church of Bear Bryant,
Yeah.
So, that's certainly how I knew Jackie Sherrill, initially at least. And now that you Aggies are over in the SEC conference, it'll be another good match. Still haven't forgiven you guys for, Johnny Football, for Johnny Mansell. He wrecked us a couple of years.
He did. He was really, really fun to watch. Well, Ben, you're one of the reasons I wanted to get you on this podcast. Probably the primary reason, to be totally candid with you, is you. This is a leadership podcast. It's a positive leadership podcast, and some of the work you've been doing over the last 5 or 6 months. I mean, obviously, throughout your entire career, has been extremely impressive to me. And so, I want to talk about some of your writings, some of your ideas, some of the narratives you're trying to get out in the world. But before we do that, who is Ben Hunt? Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got your start, and how you ended up where you are today.
Well, I keep wondering what I'm going to be when I grow up, frankly, Brian, and I suspect you're the same way. I think that, those of us who've got that entrepreneurial bug, it is a bug. It's not a feature. We can't help ourselves. We really can't help ourselves. And that's certainly been the driving impetus during the different stuff that I've done, right? So I was a professor for 10 years. I got a PhD up at Harvard, and they call it government, but every place else calls it political science, which is quite the oxymoron. Most social sciences are. But I was a professor for 10 years. I left academia to start a software company. From that, I got into financial markets, first private investing, private capital, and then public capital markets with a hedge fund. And that's been my life really for the last, 15, more than 15 years now, has been as an investor and then as a writer about investing, which really becomes a writing about not just markets, but about politics and our life as citizens as well. Because what the common thread through all of those things, through the academic career, the software company, the investing, has been my, fascination doesn't quite give it a strong enough of oomph to it, but my core belief that the human animal is driven by the unstructured information, the communications, the stories, the narratives, the messages that other humans tell us, thousands of times a day. And I believe that we are hardwired and socially trained to respond to those messages in frankly, fairly predictable ways. So that whether we're talking about political science, right, how we respond as voters to the messages that we are presented by politicians or other citizens, whether that's as an investor and how we respond to messages, whether it's central bankers or the CEO of a company or some guy they've got on CNBC. That's been the common thread through all of this. Through the academia, through the software company, through the investing, has been trying to understand how are we as poker players responding to the other players and not just to the cards we're dealt, right? That's the old saying in poker, right? That you don't just play the cards, you don't just play the fundamentals if you're an investor, but how do you play the other player? How do you play the messages that are presented to you around a poker table, for example, the betting, the body language, all like that? That's exactly the same in any sort of social situation. And again, politics or markets. So that's the common thread. That's what I like to write about with what I'm doing now is call it a blog or a series of writings called Epsilon Theory. And it's also the research that we do as part of the company we started to really pursue both the research and the writing on this.
Ben, I have degrees in computer science and philosophy, and then also a law degree.
Fantastic.
And I've been interested for a very, very long time in technology. I've been interested in ethics. My study in philosophy was primarily focused on consequentialism, utilitarianism, Kantianism, and the relative merits and strengths and weaknesses of both. But I'll tell you what really, you were talking earlier about compulsion. And
Yep.
man, that word really resonates with me, because what I have been obsessed with the study of stories, narratives, cognitive psychology. And I'll tell you, I can remember exactly when I got obsessed with it. And I've always been interested in it as a lawyer, because as a trial lawyer, I have to know what persuades people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm embarrassed to say that until the 2016 election, I was not as familiar with the way the human mind works as I should have been. And here's what really, I can remember the moment this happened, Ben. I was listening to the debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump,
Yep.
my wife, and I thought Hillary Clinton won. And I was getting texts from my dad and my brother. My dad's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force with a master's degree, very smart guy, nice guy. And my brother, and they thought the exact opposite. And I started thinking about this, Ben. Yeah, and I was like, how is it possible that people of good faith and intelligence can literally watch the exact same thing and come to completely different conclusions? How are they watching different movies? And so that led me down a 2 or 3 year, like you said, compulsion to figure out how this was possible. And I don't want to describe your writing in a way that's inaccurate, but to me, a lot of your writing lately, that is kind of the fundamental idea you're getting at, right?
It totally is, Brian. It's, there are certain, I like to call them the old stories. Right? And there are these archetypes. We would call them memes today. Right?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about mimetic theory too, because
exactly right.
Yeah.
And once you start thinking about these stories, these memes, these narratives, whatever terminology you want to use here, once you start thinking of them, and this is at the core of mimetic theory, once you start thinking of them as like a real living thing, right, with the same drives that all living things have, right, to live, to reproduce, all that. Once you start thinking of them as a living organism, right, an organism of thought, but no less really alive, quote unquote, because of that, it really does change your whole perspective on the different dimensions, frankly, that we live in as social human beings. That of course we live in the real world where you and I are sitting in actual chairs and having a actual conversation, and there are electrons going through the air.
Possibly, it could be a simulation, but
could be a simulation. That's true. But we also live in something that I like to call narrative world, which is just as alive and just as impactful on our lives as real world. But we don't have the rods and cones in our eyes to see narrative world. And that's really at the core of the research that we do around this, because there are technological tools available today. Less so, I'll call it, AI tools. It's not really a question of artificial intelligence. It's really a question of just brute force computing power to create the visualizations and use graph theory, network theory, so that we can actually see, human beings with our physical eyes. We can actually see, the wavelength of narrative world. And once you see it, it's like so many things, right? Seeing is believing.
Yeah.
Once you see it, you suddenly now see it everywhere.
It's impossible not to see it. And, I spent the quarantine reading on mathematics and physics and some things like that, but I had a chance to read The Selfish Gene, which I had never read before, by Richard Dawkins. And, I was blown away by how we can, argue about whether Richard Dawkins could have maybe a little bit nicer approach about some things. But
yes, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation, but he is a beautiful, beautiful writer. And that book is a phenomenal book. But what really caught my attention is when he introduces the concept of the meme at the end and talks about how exactly what you just said, memes are like genes. They're self-replicating. They can go from person to person. They can go from group to group, and they have impact on the real world.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely
so,
right.
there's so much you've written about that, to be totally honest with you, when I was preparing for this podcast, I was like, man, where do we even start? There's so much good stuff here, but maybe a good place to start would be with your article that came out relatively recently about the welding shut of the American mind. So
Sure.
tell
Sure.
us a little bit about the conceit or the hypothesis behind that particular point of view as expressed in your article.
Well, absolutely. And of course, that article, The Welding Shut of the American Mind, is a riff on The Closing of the American Mind
By Alan Bloom.
by Alan Bloom,
Right.
written in the late 80s. And it takes this notion of what we're describing, the memes and thinking about stories and narratives as actual entities, right? That really do affect us, just like a virus would affect us, that have these real world impacts and effects. And what I want to do, though, is, before we describe how it has that real world effect, that logical impact on the way our individual brain processes information, I want to bring in one other author, right? Because you mentioned Dawkins and the selfish gene. I also want to mention E.O. Wilson.
Sure.
So E.O. Wilson, he's an ant guy. He's a biologist. He was the greatest expert on ants in the world. Also a Southerner, by the way, and went up to Harvard, became a professor there, and became the world's foremost expert on ants. And so, how does that connect to us as humans? Well, because there's this other aspect. Why do these narratives and these messages impact us so much? And what Wilson wrote about in some of his later work was particularly a book called The Social Conquest of Earth, which, along with The Selfish Gene, is one of those books that I really think everyone needs to read.
Yeah.
And what Wilson is saying is that, look, there are 4 incredibly successful species of animals on planet Earth. There's the ant, there's the termite, there's the bee, and there's Homo sapiens, the human being. Those are, his view, and I think it's probably pretty right, the 4 most successful species on the planet. Not coincidentally, all 4 of those species have something in common. They are, in the technical sense of the word, a social animal. So a eusocial animal, EU social animal. And, there are these different scientific requirements to be a social animal. Right? But the most important one is that we immerse ourselves in these intra-species communications. We are always talking to each other. Human beings use words. Ants, bees, termites, they use chemicals, pheromones. But it's exactly the same thing. We're constantly giving messages to each other. And in a very real sense, we are hardwired. We are biologically evolved to respond to these messages that we receive with our brain chemical transmitter, all of that, right? Now, we're not as deterministic in our responses as an ant, bee, or a termite, but as a species, in the scientific sense of the word, we are, and it's problematic at times for exactly the reasons we're about to talk about, the welding shut of the American mind. The way that these memes and these messages can be used, I think, intentionally to do the queen bee's bidding, right?
Yeah.
And it can be used against us. But at the back of this, I think it's so important to understand that we are such a successful species because we are able to learn from other humans, right? We do have this ability and this both hardwired and socially trained to pick up on the messages, the unstructured text and data that other human beings are giving us. It's our great strength as a species. But what I think is happening today, particularly with the advance of technology, is that the ability to use our hardwiring and our social training, in effect, against us to intentionally move us in ways to, do the queen bee's bidding.
Yeah.
I think that's what's going on. And that's at the heart of what I'm trying to describe with the welding shut of the American mind. So, Bloom's book, and again, it's one of those great books that everyone should read, The Closing of the American Mind. Not because it's just like, Dawkins. There are parts of the book, and there are parts of Bloom and his later writings that'll, oh man, you got to be kidding me, right? It makes you mad. But like any great work of art, that should be part of the reaction. The other aspect, of course, is that it really will change the way you see the world. So those three books certainly have changed the way I've seen the world, right? Bloom's Closing the American Mind, Selfish Gene, which you brought up, and then E.O. Wilson and the Social Conquest of Earth.
And I would throw a fourth book in there, Ben, that I'm sure you've read, and that is by the book by Yuval Harari, *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*. Those books both also talk a lot about, why is it that humans became the dominant species, and it really comes down to being able to tell stories and believe fictions, at least in Yuval Harari's telling, right?
Right. I mean, basically, we are giant termites with opposable thumbs and big enough to control fire. That's it, right? And we're a giant termite with a flamethrower. That's basically what human beings are. And by God, that's enough to rule the world. It really is. It really is. But this is not, also to the point of all these authors you're describing, this is nothing new, right? This is something that successful politicians, successful leaders have known for thousands of years. What I think is different today is that everyone's in on the act, right? Everyone now understands that the creation of a story and a compelling narrative is as or more important than what you do in real world.
Yeah.
You see this so much with corporate CEOs, for example, right? The hallmark of a successful CEO today is not, did you get your, operating margins in this, business line, did you do 2 points better than you did last quarter? That's not it. It's, can you tell a story about your company that clicks with investors, your employees, everyone, so that they believe and so that they give a better, in investing terms, a better multiple on your stock, right? I mean, this is the hallmark of success today, is to tell that story. It's not just CEOs, it's central bankers. Politicians, of course, they've always known this. They know it even more today. But we're all in the storytelling business today. And that's why I think so many of us, or certainly I feel, unmoored so much of the time. It's just people barraging us with these stories and these narratives all the time. And part B, A is that everyone's in on the act. B is that our modes of communication, particularly social media, but lots of network technology, allows for these messages to be shaped, be augmented in very predictable ways that have very predictable impacts on us human beings, right? On us termites with flamethrowers. And we see this nowhere, I think, more than we see it in the political debate in the United States today. And this is what I mean about the welding shut of the American mind. Alan Bloom's point was that the quote unquote, I'll use air quotes here because he kind of does in his writing, the openness of academia and culture in the 70s and the 80s, he said, well, that actually it's not an opening, it's actually a closing of perspective, and it locks you into a certain view. And that's all, I think, true, right? I want to talk about something a little bit more than that in this article, The Welding Shut of the American Mind, because what I think we've done today with the adoption of these technologies that allow us to create and distribute our narrative so much more effectively, and the fact that everyone's in on it. So it doesn't matter what field of business or area of your family or what area of life you're exposed to, you're getting hit by these stories. I think the combination of this, it creates more than just the closing of a door. Right? A door that's closed, you can open it up again. I think what's creating is the welding shut of a mind, right? And a welded shut door, to use the economic term, that's an equilibrium, right? Just it doesn't open up on its own. It doesn't. You gotta blow up the door. And how do you do that with a mind, right? Once it's welded shut. So the process that I'm identifying is it's a very logical process. I think a lot of people tend to think of narrative as, oh, it's kind of touchy-feely. It's kind of like, oh, the sentiment is this, and so it kind of impacts you somehow, some way, kind of do little jazz hands and wave their hands at it. That's really not at all. And this goes back to what E.O. Wilson and all these others are talking about, the way we're hardwired to respond to narrative. It actually really does create triggers in our brain. So what I think is happening on both from the left and the right is the intentional creation of very specific narrative forms, memes, again, if you want to use that word, right? which lead a mind directly down a essentially programmed path to the point where it becomes a logical consistency to say, nope, the only thing in the world that I think you should complain about or talk about is Donald Trump. Or, nope, the only thing in the world I think you should think about or talk about is, those gosh darn, communists who want to take over. It's, people aren't being stupid, right? If you disagree or you haven't been infected with the syllogism yet, you think, oh, that's just nuts, that's crazy. But it's something that happens over and over again in human history. But today, the instruments and the number of people who are trying to use those instruments against you, I think, has never been greater.
Have you watched The Social Dilemma yet?
Yeah, I have.
So I've, as a computer science guy, who's been really interested in technology for 30 years now. I was basically aware of what Jared Lanier and Tristan Harris and all those people have been saying for a very, very long time. But what I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm understanding you correctly, Ben, is the mechanisms to persuade people to create narratives have existed for a very long time, but the technology we have now is like jet fuel on the ability to persuade large groups of people. Is that kind of what you're getting at least in part?
No, that's very much what I'm getting at. So I'll give you a story. When I was running my hedge fund, we had a position in a company that makes slot machines, for casinos. A company called Scientific Games.
Yep.
And so we were in Connecticut. Scientific Games, the headquarters was up in Rhode Island. And so I remember going out to visit the company, and they took me to where they are designing new slot machines. And well, this has got to be pretty interesting, right? I mean, because it's like social media, right? How do you design both the payout structure? How do you design and the graphics, right? The motif of the game, right? How do you design that slot machine to train human beings to pull that lever or push those buttons and get as much coins in with getting as few going out as possible?
Yeah.
And no joke, Brian, in the lab there, they actually have their testers. They have them wired up to an EEG, right? I mean, you are testing, its actual physical impact on your brain. You are testing the way your eyes move. They're tracking your eye movement across the screen. They're tracking your blood chemical levels. This was 15 years ago, right? With a fraction of the budget that Facebook or that any of these guys devote to understanding how the human physiology interacts with the content and the delivery mechanism that they're providing. Another example, Robinhood, right? So the app that's so common, right, for participating in markets, right? You open an account on Robinhood, you can buy a Tesla share.
Yeah.
Well, we don't call them UIs anymore. We don't call it a user interface. We call it a UX, right? We call it a user experience.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And so the UX for Robinhood is designed to play. That's the word they use, like a computer game. Right? So they actually talk about in the, if you have a Robinhood app, the first thing is, you'll buy a stock or sell a stock or two. Then they'll say, okay, now we want you to level up by trading options.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is what's happening. And so it's not just in,
it's like the gamification of everything, right? Everything's being gamified and financialized.
Everything's been gamified, but in the same direction. Everything's being gamified to be in that direction of what is the compelling story or memes or imagery that we can communicate to get you to do what we want you to do, right? Yeah. Which is to trade more on Robinhood, which is to put more coins into that slot machine, which is to, watch more Facebook posts so we can sell more advertising. It's not just social media. It has been going on for decades. It's just now that everyone is in on the act, and whatever you're doing in your life as a human being today, you are coming into contact with these entities that are trying to do this with you.
And I would argue, Ben, it's asymmetric warfare. I don't know if warfare is the right term, but I mean, you've got billion-dollar corporations with huge deep learning machines against your little brain and my little brain, and it's just not a fair fight. And so I guess the question I would have for you, Ben, is when the mind gets welded shut, what do you do next? I mean, what do you do about that?
Well, frankly, there's not a lot you can do once it's being welded shut. I think what we can do, however, is to try to prevent more minds from being welded shut. And I think that is possible. And that's really why, I left the asset management firm where I was, working to start my own independent company. Because you have to get outside of the belly of the beast. You have to get outside of one of those institutions that has $1 billion and is trying to, get their message across. And so what I think what one can do, not to make yourself immune to the effect, but to make yourself insulated from the effect. An inoculated against the effect was something you have to keep getting booster shots from,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
Is what I was describing earlier. Once you see it, right, and once somebody describes to you, that's what Robinhood is doing. They are intentionally getting you to, and they're using words like level up, right, to get you to use options, right? I give you a ton more examples from investing. ETFs, exchange traded funds, right?
Yeah.
ETFs don't exist for your benefit, Brian. ETFs exist for the benefit of the people who make the ETFs, of the asset management firms.
Yeah, you don't say.
Right. But you'd never think that. No. This is good for you, right? This is and 1,001 examples of this. However, though, I think once you can kind of create that sort of intellectual distance, once you can step back from the poker table and say, oh, okay, I'm now looking at the game that's being played. Again, once you see it once, you'll see it everywhere.
It's ridiculous. I couldn't agree with that more. Once I started looking into this, Ben, I could not unsee it. There's a science fiction writer named Neil Stephenson who I like a lot, and he wrote a book called I think it's called Fall or Dodge in Hell. Have you ever?
I've read it. Yeah.
So the beginning of that book talks about there's essentially two categories of people. There's people that have had their minds completely and totally welded shut by technology and social media, and they think there's been a nuclear attack on the Moab facility in Utah, and it turns out the whole thing didn't happen. And so I was sitting there when I was reading this book going, wow, man, we're really headed towards something like this. And then I started reflecting on it, and I said, I think we're already there. We're
already there.
Yeah.
It's so right. So that that's what I try to write about in Epsilon Theory, and that really is the goal, right? That to create that intellectual, emotional distance, both from corporations, from political parties. And none of this is meant to try to say, oh, go off the grid and, not to participate, not to be in the world.
Don't be Ted Kaczynski or
yeah, exactly. I'm not suggesting that. I'm really not.
Let's not go too far with this. Let's interact with the world, but let's do it in a mature and wise way. Is maybe what you're saying.
Distance.
Yeah.
It's reclaiming your distance. I think it's both the hardest thing to do, and I fail at this every day. Right? I'll read some tweet or I'll read something and I'll go, and because it's literally the physical impact on my brain chemistry and everything else. And so no one's perfect in this, and it does require just constant self-reflection, but there are some kind of simple ways to do it. Like I always ask myself when I see something that's making me mad or aggravated, say, why am I reading this now? Right? But what is we call it the metagame, right? Why is this being published now? Right? Can I step back and give myself a little bit of distance? There's a wonderful story. There was you're talking about before we started about a podcast you did with a Hollywood producer. Yeah, so another author and then turns Hollywood producers, Michael Crichton, right? So Jurassic Park probably is best known, but for me it was Andromeda Strain, right? I don't know if you remember that book from
sure, yeah,
way back in the day. But Michael Crichton really invented the scientific thriller. So such a long list of books, whether it's Westworld, right? Jurassic Park, Disclosure. He wrote one about the aircraft industry, airframe or something like that, right? So he invented that whole scientific thriller genre. But he was giving a talk, and he was talking about narrative and the way that we're hardwired to respond to these. And he said, I've decided to call this the Gell-Man amnesia, after his buddy Murray Gell-Man. So Murray Gell-Man's a physicist. He's the discoverer, at least he named quarks, right? So that was Murray Gell-Man's claim to fame. But Crichton was giving this talk, and he said, I've decided to call this Gell-Man amnesia because I've figured this out by talking to my friend Murray. That you'll be reading the newspaper, and let's say it's a story that I know a lot about, some Hollywood story comes out, and I'll read that story about Hollywood, and I'll think, oh my God, this is just a crock. They just totally got this story wrong.
Yep.
The causality is wrong. The participants are wrong. Everything's wrong about this story. And Crichton says, and this is so true, if you've ever had a story about you or your company written about in the newspaper, you know exactly what he's saying. You read that story and you say, this is nonsense. This is ridiculous. Right? But he says, but then I'll turn the page and I'll read a story, about something about which I don't have a lot of inside information, personal information. Maybe it's a story about physics. Maybe it's a story about Palestine. And I'll read that story right after I've read this story that I thought to myself, oh my God, this is just totally wrong. They totally messed it up. I'll read this new story after I turn the page and I'll go, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, didn't know that. We have this amnesia effect that even though we'll read a story where we really know the real facts and we think, oh my God, this story that I'm reading, this is nonsense. We turn the page and the next story we read, we go, that's interesting. It's that amnesia. It's that inability to step back and say, okay, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's a lie. I'm just saying read it with some critical distance. It's so hard for us to do as human beings. But it's never been more necessary, Brian. It's never been more necessary to find that critical distance with all the messages that we get barraged by, because otherwise we lose ourselves, and that's the intent of the people who are writing these messages.
Can I ask you and you actually wrote an article, and many of your recent articles have kind of common threads throughout, but one of the titles of your articles, Why Am I Reading This Right Now?
Yeah.
Which I think is a great article. But before we talk about that a little bit, can I ask you a kind of a fundamental first principles question?
Sure.
And it's this. I hear what you're saying about, asking yourself, why am I reading this right now, getting critical distance? Fundamentally, though, how do you remember to do that? Like what have you done to remind? And the reason I ask that is because one thing that's helped me a lot is meditation, and it's helped me get a little distance between my thoughts and emotions and my awareness. But for you, Ben, fundamentally, how do you do that? Like how do you keep reminding yourself to ask those kind of questions?
Well, it's first of all, let me say I think, Brian, that is the hallmark of meditation, right? Is creating that internal distance.
Yeah,
Within that separation.
That's right.
That's right. And so I think that whether you find it through a technique like meditation, right, or whether you find it for me the tech, it's not a formal technique like a meditation. It is a professional lifetime of studying the sausage making, right?
Yeah.
And studying the way in which these messages are being created to have an intended impact. I find that, and I really just think this is just from a lifetime of being immersed in this. I read all the same stuff that you do, or I'm sure your listeners do. I think I read differently. I think I read for, why did they choose that word choice, or what's that word cluster there for? I've spoken to, and I think this was Crichton's point actually about talking about his physicist friend Murray Gell-Man. Gell-Man would see the physical world differently, right, than Crichton, the writer. Crichton, the writer, would see words and stories differently than Gell-Man would. I mean, it's hard to describe, Brian, but sometimes I feel like I can see, whether it's in colors or strands, the weaving behind a story, right? Behind a story or something that I'm hearing. So I wish I had some formula or, top 10 tips for, thinking critically.
Yeah.
But for me personally, and it is always a struggle, but it's been a lifetime of being involved with the sausage making. And so seeing those strands that are behind the words that you're actually reading.
Can I suggest something to you along those lines?
Please.
Could it also perhaps be because, as somebody who was involved in financial markets for a while, if you don't think clearly, there are very real world costs to that. Whereas if you go on Facebook and make a post, and it could be the stupidest post anybody has ever put on social media in history, there's essentially no cost to that. There's no downside risk to making a stupid post on Facebook because of your training as a financial guy. You've had to maybe do some things to make sure you're thinking, like to check your biases. And the reason I bring this up, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a very, very smart person. He's a lawyer in Fort Worth, and he's on the school board talking about school reopenings. And I was just so impressed by how clearly he thinks about this. And I was mentioning to him, why can't everybody think this clearly? And he said, well, you got to keep in mind, you're an engineer and a lawyer. You've been trained to think a certain way. Not everybody's been trained to think that way. And so do you think maybe some of your thinking is because of your training in the financial markets, where bad decisions have real world costs to them?
I think your point about how you are trained to think is so important, Brian. Because my wife's a lawyer, my brother's a lawyer. You're a lawyer. that's what they always say in law school, right? You're being trained to think like a lawyer.
Right.
Ditto for medical school. You're trained to think like a doctor, which I think it's like you're being trained to think like a mechanic. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that's
right.
literally the way you're trained to think.
Sure, it's a different style of thinking for sure, right?
What I find is that the most successful type of person in investing, investment world, is someone who's been trained to think strategically. And what I mean by that is, and this is, I think it's like, are you a poker player? Are you a good poker player? Are you a good bridge player? Are you a good risk player? Right? I mean, the game of risk.
Yeah.
Do you like to play games, strategic games of strategic thought, not first-person shooters, right? But strategy games, where what you do has an impact on what someone else does, but you know that they're thinking the same way, right? That you're playing another player who's also thinking strategically. I find that people who are raised or trained to think, to be successful in those sort of games of strategy, those games of interactive strategic thinking, that's the type of thinking you have to be a successful investor.
Yep.
So I love your notion of how you're trained to think.
Yep.
But it's. Did you grow up playing poker? I bet you're going to be a good investor. That's my rule of thumb on this.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Well, and to kind of put a concrete example on this, one of the things that I was very worried on early in the pandemic, I was worried about two things. One of the things I was worried about was the inability of most people to grasp the concept of exponential growth and what that really means. But the other thing that I was really worried about was, let's say, for instance, that we took some steps to mitigate the spread, quarantines, mask usage, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And then the spread slowed and it wasn't as bad as we predicted. My big fear was people would draw the wrong conclusions about that. They would say, well, it must not have been that big of a deal to begin with.
Must not have been that bad.
It must not have been that bad. And so I was worried to death about that, Ben. And I see that right now. I see people just not, in my opinion, drawing the right conclusions about these sorts of things. And, that we were talking earlier about the article you wrote, Why Am I Reading This Now? Mm-hmm. And that article had to do with some senators getting upset about a Chinese science fiction writer and Netflix releasing a movie. And I'm sure you've read the ThreeBody Problem, the trilogy, which is, the title is about an orbital mechanics program, calculating the relative momentum and inertia and movement of bodies using Newtonian mathematics and physics, which is essentially an unsolvable problem. But it has nothing to do at all with Chinese propaganda, unless I'm just totally missing it. And I think
you're not missing it. And that was what I was right. I mean, the author, and I'll butcher the name, Liu Cixin, and I'm sorry, I'm sure I mispronounced that.
I was actually going to ask you how to pronounce it because
I'm sure I think it's the best science fiction I think that's been written since Isaac Asimov and the Foundation trilogy.
Phenomenal. I would put Ted Chiang in that group too. Although
I agreed, right?
Yeah.
But it's a phenomenal work of art, and there is a question here, right? So the author is he's not outspoken about this, but if you ask him, he's an unapologetic apologist, right, for the Chinese government. In particular, their treatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province and west of China. And I think that's a pretty reprehensible view to have. Does it mean that his art, his book, should not be, I'll say, developed or turned into a film or TV by Netflix? My view is it shouldn't have that impact. Well-meaning people can disagree, right? I mean, if we're talking about, this example I used in, 1930s, Germany, would I want to have a retrospective of Lady Riefenstahl, and
Yeah.
the answer is no. It's
Yeah.
but that her work of art, I mean, I think she's a good artist, but her work of art was directly for the glorification of the German Nazi state at the time. And so she's on one end of the spectrum. I think Liu Cixin and the ThreeBody Problem is at another end of the spectrum. But the question that I ask, why am I reading this now, is that I don't think that the 5 senators who are writing a letter to Netflix, are really that concerned about, that question I'm asking about. I don't think they're well-meaning in the sense of, I'm not sure if she's on the Leni Riefenstahl side of the spectrum or, the other side of the spectrum.
Right.
They wanted a talking point. They wanted to create this welding shut, process.
They're not
they
asking.
wanted a good meme to use against.
Yeah, they're not asking, is this Chinese communist propaganda, or is it a very elegant philosophical treatise about ontology and epistemology and what it would mean? I mean, those are not the questions they're asking.
That is not the question they're asking.
Yeah.
Right? That was not why they. Yeah. That is not why I am reading this now, right? Yeah. It is not a good faith effort to explore these questions, and so that's an example of what we're describing. Once you kind of ask yourself that, you can step back from it. I think it helps to keep you from getting drawn into this and to let those brain chemicals just start clicking and whirring and become trapped, right, in these syllogisms that I think are intentionally put forward out there to trap you. So that's what you have to do, I think.
I think that's a good segue into another article you wrote, and I'm trying to kind of take these are not necessarily in the order in which you published them, but I've tried to reorder them in my brain to have a consistent narrative.
It's a rabbit hole, man. You just got to go down the rabbit hole.
But you wrote an article called Lucifer's Hammer, which or a blog post or whatever we're calling them nowadays, and that to me was the article. The first couple articles we talked about are more about identifying the problem and describing the problem and then saying that this is the problem we're faced with and here's why we're faced with it. But Lucifer's Hammer actually offers some ideas about changing the narrative. And so talk a little bit about what the main idea or ideas you were trying to get forth or get out there with Lucifer's Hammer.
Well, if you're of a certain age, right? So you might remember, it was I think it was Larry Niven who wrote Jerry Pournelle, other science fiction writers. We've mentioned a lot of science fiction writers in this podcast, right?
Nerd alert.
So they wrote a sci-fi novel called Lucifer's Hammer. It was about a comet striking the Earth. And then the post-apocalyptic world that came after that, and for whatever reason, it's one of those books you read when you're 13 or 14 and it hits you at just the right time. And what I remember about that book is thinking, this whole post-apocalyptic world, it doesn't sound so bad. Right? Which is what I think so many teenage boys or perpetual teenage boys, and I gotta admit, sometimes I still think, in the post-apocalyptic world, when that motorcycle gang, comes to take over my farm, here's how I'm going to defend myself, right? Yeah. And it's always terribly romantic and self-sufficient and meritocratic and
as soon as you start thinking that, read The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
Well, that's the thing, right?
Right.
That's
right.
Exactly right. Cormac McCarthy is my all-time favorite author, and The Road is a hell of a book.
It's a love story, but boy, is it a tough love story. Golly.
It's a tough love story.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's a tough love story. But your point, the context of the love story, as you're describing, is what I think a post-apocalyptic world would be pretty much right, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, to quote Thomas Hobbes. So I think that in so much of the protest movement we have today, particularly the after hours protest movement of, the Antifa and the Proud Boys and the the cosplay that goes on, right, with the urban protests and violence, is this, it's LARPing, right? It's live action role playing, right? That is not what the revolution actually looks like.
That's
right.
right.
It's play acting, and it makes me so mad because it's play acting that is encouraged by political parties because they think that it would be a competitive advantage to put all of their effort and momentum into halting that cosplay, LARPing, urban violence. And it makes me really mad because if we get to a point where the real thing happens, we're going to learn pretty soon that that it is the road, right? It's not Lucifer's hammer. It's not this romantic libertarian, meritocratic post.
We're all communal farmers, and we all
exactly right. No, it's
5 pigs and all that sort of thing. That's not the way it turns out. It will happen.
It's not the way it ever turns out.
Yeah.
No, and you don't have to go too far back in history to get a lot of examples of that. So, you say, well, what can you do? What is the action that is required here? I think it is first what we're describing about thinking and just recognizing what's happening and the messages that are being played out to create that intellectual distance so that you don't find yourself, in a sense, aiding and abetting the violence part of this. But when it comes to action, I am an enormous believer in social change and not just veneer social change, but like we were talking earlier, blowing up, a lot of things, right? The rules of the game to get out of these cozy equilibria that don't allow for incremental change. So I'm all for political activism, right? And my vote is the merest part of my political life. So I do believe very strongly that in this world where narrative is so compelling and is so dominant, that nonviolence has never been more important in social activism. That it's not just, my view, the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do, right? Think about that protest in Portland. It was a month, maybe 6 weeks or so ago, where the Navy vet, right, the guy wearing the Navy, the big dude, he stands in front of the goon squad, right, and he takes a beating. He just takes a beating. And think about how powerful that was, right? That this is somebody who believes in their principles. He went there because he believes in imagine this, the Constitution of the United States. And he took a beating to show that. Man, that's a narrative that works. That's a meme that works. And so I think that when you kind of step back and you think about, well, what's the smart way to act and be a political activist in a world that's dominated by narrative? There are, two can play at this game of creating sausage, right? Two can play at the game of creating messages that resonate for the hearts and minds of other citizens. So that's what that article is talking about. It's and that's what I mean about taking action that doesn't fit with your 13-year-old boy romantic version of what being a rebel's all about. But I'm telling you, this is the way to win a political struggle and to be active political in the world we have today.
Ben, I would be remiss if I did not ask you about the acronym or BIFTD. Burn it the fuck down. That's that you kind of made that famous, but and that when you first hear that, it has certain connotations. But explain to us what you mean when you say BIFTD, burn it the fuck down. What are you talking?
Burn it the fuck down. So my catchphrase for a long time was "they're not even pretending anymore."
Yeah.
And that changed, frankly, with the with Epstein's death in prison, right? And I don't know if it's suicide. I don't know if it was. Here's my point. I don't care. I don't care. There's this wonderful scene in The Godfather where Vito is meeting with the 5 families, and he's got to bring his son Michael back home from Italy. And they're making peace at this meeting of the 5 families. And Vito's with the group. He says, "Look, I forgive the death, the murder of my son. This is after Sonny Corleone's been killed. I forgive this. We're going to make the peace. But here's what I do not forgive. I'm going to bring my son Michael back home to the United States. And, if some accident were to befall him, right, he gets hit by lightning, or he's arrested and he hangs himself in his cell. He says, I'm a superstitious man. This I do not forgive." And I got to tell you, I'm a superstitious man too. It doesn't matter to me whether it was murder or suicide. The job of a non-corrupt state is to keep Epstein alive for trial. The fact that he was not alive for trial, by definition, that cannot happen in a non-corrupt state. So the first time I used that phrase, "burn it the fuck down," which I try to use as BITFD for PG-13 reasons, was after that. I was really shook by that, by the whole.
Can I interject something right there,
Yeah,
Ben?
sure.
Because the phrase that I started using after the Epstein deal was, they're doing it right in front of our faces in public. And so that's what I've started saying. Like, they're literally doing it right in front of us. And it's gotten to the point now where it's so close to us.
Yep.
That we can't even see what's going on.
You can't focus on it, right?
Can't focus on it, yeah.
And that's another point of what I mean about getting that distance, right? You've got to be able to step back so that you have a field of vision where you can focus on this, because it is happening right in front of our eyes. They're not pretending anymore. And they is, what's they? It's concentrated institutions of wealth and power, right? It's what I like to call smiley face authoritarianism, right? It's not the jackboots of 1984. It's not someone stomping on your face, right? It's that smiley face button telling you a story, right? A narrative to put you back to sleep.
Yeah.
To say just move along, nothing to see here, folks.
Yep.
And that's what I mean. That's what I want to burn down. Right? I remember, so there was the riots. There was with George Floyd. There was some riots in Atlanta, and I remember this rapper Killer Mike comes on and he gives this talk. He says, "Look, what we mean when we say burn it down, we want to burn down the system. You're not burning down people's damn homes.
Right.
Give me a break here, people." And it really does require that sort of leadership. You're talking about leadership in this series. The hardest aspect of leadership, and it's an aspect of leadership that I think the Black Lives Movement has totally failed. The hardest part of leadership in the modern world is to aggressively reject violence as part of your efforts. And I'm not saying that the BLM leadership embraces violence, but I think they're okay with it.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think they're okay with it. And not only do I believe that is wrong, right, but I also believe it's not smart. It's not effective.
How do you deal with, Ben? How do you deal with, because I couldn't agree with you more. I agree with you 100% about what you're saying here, but how do you agree with, or how do you deal with the agent provocateurs? How do you deal with the cop up in, I think it was in Portland,
Yep.
who's dressed in all black, who's going around busting out windows and getting caught on video, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. That worries me as much as the BLM not speaking out against violence as strongly as they should. So how do you deal with the agent provocateurs?
So whenever you are the underdog, and this is true for whether you're a sports team, this is true for whether it's a social justice movement, whatever it is, you must have discipline, right? It's the sine qua non for being effective, right?
Yep.
You've got to have more discipline than the other bigger, stronger team you're up against. And it's the hardest thing to do. You know why? Because discipline ain't fun. Discipline's a real drag.
It's a lot more fun to throw a brick through a window.
It's a lot more fun to throw a brick through a window. It's a lot more fun to, take a punch at whoever. Discipline's a real drag.
Yeah.
And yet, that is the one thing that you've got to have as that underdog organization. Again, whether it's a team. I mean, think about it. We were talking about Bear Bryant, Jackie Sherrill, the podcast she did. I mean, my God, when Bear Bryant was at A&M, discipline? Are you kidding? I mean, the just infamous, frankly, right?
Yeah.
For what was required there. But it is required. And discipline, I think, has this connotation of being formed through muscles or guns or what have you, right? We think of armies as being disciplined, and they are for this very reason. Armies are disciplined, fighting forces are disciplined, not for how they shoot the gun, but for how they don't shoot the gun.
That's right.
For how they don't shoot the gun.
That's right.
You want a disciplined leader? MLK. You want a disciplined leader? Gandhi. Right? Right? You think those guys didn't maintain discipline? Oh, yeah, they did. But that's what's required. That is the hallmark of leadership for the underdog. Again, whether you're talking about a protest movement or you're talking about a sports team.
Ben, we've gone slightly over our time. I have one or two more questions, if you don't mind. And I know you got a lot going on, but I talked to a good friend of mine, a guy named Ryan Kruger, last night. He was really excited that you were coming on the podcast. And he wanted me to ask you, and I wanted to ask you too. I want to ask you kind of a two-part question. Number one, over the next 6, 8, 12 months, whatever time frame you want to use, what are your plans to try to get this ship we call American democracy go back head in the right direction? Number one. And number two is, what do you kind of see, generally speaking, over the next 6, 12, 18 months? How are things going to change? What are you thinking about as far as the near future is concerned?
So I'll say the good news, first of all, is I think people are waking the fuck up.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think that whether it's COVID, whether it's this election, whatever car alarm is going off in your head right now, I think it's waking a lot of people up. And the challenge here is that people are going to wake up and they're going to think, oh, I'm going to cast my vote in 5 weeks. And then they're going to go back to sleep. And both political parties are going to try to get you to go back to sleep.
Yep.
Their little pod people world. The challenge, and what I want to be working on, is to to rally, to, yes, organize people who've woken up and get them to be unsatisfied with just the participation in the prescribed forms of Democratic or GOP, the chutes that they want to put you through. What that means is finding stories to tell people that say, okay, here's an alternative, that we don't have to express our identity through a political party. or through a corporation. No, you express your identity with, I like to call it your pack, right? It's the people in your life who don't treat you as a means to an end. Right? You're talking about, your Kantian studies earlier, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because political parties, corporations, they treat you as a means to an end. And that ain't your pack, right? The people who have your back, who treat you as an autonomous human being, an end in and of itself, and demand the same in return, you find those people, and what you can do in this world to make the world a better place, it's limitless. It's limitless. It doesn't happen from the top down. It happens from the bottom up. It always does. This is the way that societies are always made better, happening from the bottom up, from determined people who've got each other's back, who share a belief in what I like to call the small L liberal virtues and the small C conservative virtues.
Yep.
We got to keep those fires alive.
Prudence and progress. That's what I would describe those two as.
Right on, brother.
Yeah. Prudence
right on.
And progress. Yeah.
Liberty and justice for all.
Yep.
These words actually mean something. And when they are expressed from the bottom up, through helping your neighbor, through protecting your neighbor, from making, from innovating, from creating, that's what saves this world for my kids and your kids and everybody's for generations to come. So anyway, that was really a roundabout way to say it. So it's for me personally, it's continuing to do these bottom up actions wherever I can. It's connecting people in this community. Again, I'm going to call it pack. It's writing. Continue to write the notes. I mean, we've got 100,000 people in the Epsilon Theory pack right now. I'll think I'll have a book coming out at the end of the year to try to take this message to a wider audience. That's the plan, man. That's the plan.
Ben, this has been, and like I said at the very beginning, an intellectual feast for me. And I hope that you would consider me to be part of your pack. One of the reasons I started this leadership podcast in April during the quarantine was I just got sick of seeing everybody complain all the time, got sick of all the negativity. And I was like, I'm going to try to demonstrate to people that you can have good, hard conversations about a lot of different things and not be an asshole to each other. And so that's been my kind of contribution. And man, I cannot think of a better guest on these topics than Ben Hunt. So Ben, whatever I can do, whatever my listeners can do to help you in your efforts, let me know. I like I said at the very beginning, I could not be more impressed by what you're doing. And one of the reasons I think you're such a great leader is because you're taking positions that cause you to get a lot of criticism from a lot of different people, and you do it anyway. And so anyway, I just want to say how much I admire you, how much I look up to you. I just absolutely love reading every single one of your articles. I would encourage you maybe to do a little more of this, more podcasting, because some people don't want to read as much. And you've got so many good ideas that I just want to spread these as far as possible. So Ben Hunt of Epsilon Theory, ladies and gentlemen, what a great show. Ben, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Brian. This was just a blast for me. And I love, you being part of the Epsilon Theory pack. But I got to tell you, Brian, I'm honored to be part of your pack. So thanks, you, sir.
Hey, Brian Beckcom here. I hope you really liked the latest episodes of Lessons from Leaders. I really, really appreciate all the thousands and thousands of people that have commented, that have listened, that have subscribed, that have seen the shows. And if you're liking the show, it would really, really help me and all the guests if you would give it a rating, if you would subscribe, if you would comment and share on it. The algorithms that run the underlying platform, like I've talked about earlier, really like that. And so I'm not getting paid for this. The people that are on the show are not getting paid for this. We're doing this for one reason. We're doing this to spread some positive leadership, some positive stories, some fun stories out in the world. We've got far too much fighting going on right now. And so Lessons from Leaders is designed to focus on basically 100% positive leadership. And so if you're liking the show, if you want me to keep doing it, if you want me to keep getting good guests, boy, I would really, really appreciate it if you could like, comment, share, subscribe, do all those things so the podcast algorithms will continue to serve it up and more people will see it. And hopefully my guests and their views will have an even wider impact on the world than they already have. So anyway, thank you very much. And on to the next episode.